Good evening, everyone. I'm Keith, Dean of the Architecture Division at CCA. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight for this lecture by Jennifer Newsom and Tom Carruthers of Dream the Combine. This is the fourth event of our fall 2021 lecture series. If you'd like, you can enable closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window with the live transcript button. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to tell you about the next event in our series, Confluence Conversation, next Wednesday, October 27th at 5 o'clock, in which 5 CCA architecture faculty, Kristen Smith and Ryan Kearns, Tom Falders, Clark Tenhouse, and Mark Donahue, will speak about the relationship between pedagogy, practice, and their entries to the recent Urban Confluence competition in San Jose. You can find the full fall lecture schedule along with stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome artists and architects Jennifer Newsom and Tom Carruthers of Dream the Combine to CCA. Dream the Combine is a collaborative creative practice that creates site-specific installations exploring metaphor, imaginary environments, and perceptual uncertainties that cast doubt on our known understanding of the world. The practice is based in Minneapolis and Ithaca, New York, where they are both assistant professors at the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell. Jennifer received her Bachelor of Arts from Yale and her Master of Architecture from Yale. While at Yale, she organized a two-day symposium, Black Boxes, Enigmas of Space and Race, held at the School of Architecture, and for which, if I remember correctly, Jennifer, I was a respondent or something, interlocutor. It's a while ago, we were just talking about this. Tom received his Bachelor of Arts in Drawing and Sculpture from Brown University and his Master of Architecture from Yale. Working together as Dream the Combine with a trusted group of engineers and fabricators, they investigate conceptual intersections between art, architecture, and cultural theory through structures that disrupt common expectations and manipulate the boundary between real and illusory space. They are winners of a number of important prizes and awards, including the 2021 McKnight Fellowship for Visual Artists, the 2020-2021 J. Irwin and Xenia S. Miller Prize, the 2018 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program Award, the 2018 Art Omi Architecture Residency, and the 2017 FSP Jerome Foundation Fellowship. Recently, they were named co-curators of the 2023 Counterpublic Triennial in St. Louis. The work of Dream the Combine has been published widely, including features in Metropolis, Architectural Record, the New York Times, Dezeen, Architect's Newspaper, Architect Magazine, Archinect, and Log. I've known Jennifer and Tom since their days as graduate architecture students at Yale. In fact, they were in the first studio that I taught when I arrived at Yale in 2003. Sorry to date you two. And then since then, it's been inspiring for me to witness the trajectory of their lives as caring and creative makers as they built a joint practice that leverages each of their distinct talents and energies to challenge and reshape our perception of the world and our place in it. I'm thrilled to have them here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Tom to CCA.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Keith. Keith, you were so patient with us, especially considering the fact that we were both about 5 years old when you were teaching us.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. I am going to share our screen and see if we can, okay.
So the crucial question that we may need to ask for a show of hands is we have about an hour and we could show 3 projects or 4. And I think the show of hands, I think we're aiming towards 4.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. 4, everyone's saying 4. Okay, great. We're gonna try and make it happen. So I'm gonna talk faster now. No, thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to speak to you all this afternoon. As Keith said, we've known him since we were graduate students when he was a new professor at Yale. And Keith gave me the great advice that I still repeat to my own students, that they need to find ways to create at the speed of their ideas. Eschewing preciousness and the perfectionism that plagues so many people when they are starting out and trying to do it right. So he said to, kind of suspend some of that for the moment and just like be willing to make and get messy. So thank you.
He also directed us to just go and draw the building out. And so we did it and it was tortuous. And we came back the next day and he sees the drawings up on the wall and I hear, now was that so bad?
Yeah. So, he's about making pain to minimize it in a longer effort, I guess. But so this is very meta part of the lecture. But tonight we'd like to show the work of the kind of intervening years between then and now, after Tom and I graduated from Yale. Worked in offices, he at Gwathmey Siegel and Diller Scafillo Renfro, and me at Cooper Robertson and Ajay Associates and Deborah Burke Partners. Left New York, had children, and started Dream the Combine, which is the name of our practice. It's maybe a funny name, but it speaks to the aspirational combination of our strengths and our speculative imaginings, a third space where we can make and grow. The name comes from our then 20-month-old son and his answer to the question of what he had dreamt about the night before. He was talking about a combine harvester, but something about the name stuck in its strangeness. Both dream and combine can be nouns or verbs, and this movement between thing and action is a defining oscillation in our work. That the dreaming is rooted somewhere in a real thing that has real materials and evokes real encounters between people. We are makers committed to ranging physical matter in the world. The things we make are relationships of labor, of global flows of material, of systems much larger than the localized object. And our firm name speaks to the projective capacity of those collaborative efforts. We aim to work productively with difference, affirming the both and rather than either or, as a conceptual stance that extends to the ethos of our practice.
Jennifer and I are both makers. We don't identify as a design build practice, and yet we're both willing to get our hands dirty. We talk about if architecture is a service profession, what are we working in service of? And you can see here, Jennifer is looking for that beautifully profiled weld. I think I'm in Unit Pit in Vancouver, Canada, trimming some material that we got, if you like, from a pile driving company that we were able to use as a materials library. We fabricate our own work as a way to more deeply integrate our intentions with the means by which they're realized. I get this perhaps from the sculpture background, from my mentor, Ursula von Reidingswart, a sculptor in Brooklyn. So it's really about engaging with process as a necessary and recursive component of the work. As my dad has said, things become apparent sometimes as you go along. The key is you have to start.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
We got 4 projects.
Yeah, we got 4 projects, so we got to click faster. So like many young firms, we sort of started in the beginning, taking on lots of different types of work, but the things that have kind of helped us, reach some sort of prominence that you're willing to invite us here to blather on to you all tonight are public art installations, all of which it's really important to us actually that our work is accessible to kind of multiple publics, that it's actually out there in the world and not behind some sort of velvet rope. So this is kind of a map showing the sort of distribution of our work to date. Much of the work is about challenging perceptions, engaging procedural memory, and reordering space to encourage new ways of engaging with context and with each other.
We've done works in greenfield sites. This is a sculpture park just north of the Twin Cities in 2017. We've done works on transcontinental railroad tracks, engaging with infrastructure, with complementary ideas of visual infrastructure, opening up space for different people in publics. We have done work on outcroppings of infrastructure. In this case, this very public corner in Vancouver, Canada, where the steam clock, at least at this point, was taken down for repairs, but questioning ideas of heritage and origin. And we have, I think the final project we're going to show today, which is based in Columbus, Indiana, picks up this theme from this project in particular, where we are questioning origin myths. Many of our projects are looking at infrastructural systems, both operable and, in this case, inoperable. These urban voids are, to a degree, inspired by Matta Clark's Odd Lots. And you can see here one of these voids connected back to itself in a recursive way. It creates an animate and searching space of character and response, not only to the wind, in this case to a windstorm that Jennifer is shooting in, but also to the gentleness of people's touch. We like to think of, if we are working with space, then we're also working in with perspective. We're working in with structure. And in this case, a sort of misreading of Erwin Panofsky's perspective as symbolic form is perspective as actual form. So this project that is looking at walking vanishing points is held up by a 12-point tensegrity structure. And I think we'll get to this in our projects, but increasingly we're able to be much more intentional with the things that early on caused, at least me, a lot of anxiety, and that's working with people. I think that's the most vulnerable and if you like, the more kind of tender fulcrum of the practice.
Yeah, and I think we're pretty intentional in talking about people rather than audience and trying to kind of lessen these sort of like distancing terms. I think we really think of it that like the work is being co-authored by the people who encounter it. And now in sharing the work with you all tonight, you're also sort of taking some ownership over the work and carrying it with you from this point forward.
So in that sense, like, please don't look at the images that we're showing you and videos as forms of documentation. This is like, we are continuing to write the projects anew. Longing project by these adjacent to some transcontinental railroad tracks is both an emotional expression and a verbal play on lengthening. We found this in 2013. This is in Calgary, they call it +15s. This is just a skyway system. And this is the only fragment ever to have been removed from the Minneapolis skyway system, which is an 8-mile contiguous, if you like, segregated space in downtown Minneapolis. You can see it here, this red rectangle that hovers over top of a dash black line, which is a new, I wanted to say it's not monorail.
Light rail.
Thank you. That.
It's probably not new anymore since this project is a little old, but
it is a little scary that it's 6 years old. But see, a couple of architects bought this little red rectangle and moved it to a sort of marginal city-owned piece of property in the hopes that they would be able to do a kind of series of Photoshop exercises to turn this into a library or someone's house and thereby pay off their student loans. It didn't work out for them. But we, after a 2-year run-up, were able to find a 2-month window of time in the spring of 2015 to do an installation that we fundraised for and designed in collaboration with our close friend and engineer artist Clayton Binkley.
And fabricated by Bo Jacobson, who
Oh yeah,
later went into practice with.
So here you have if you like, a fragment of a system of a network. And here we're thinking of Anna Munster's Anesthesia of Networks book, which came out, I think, in 2014. This analog artifact, we're really wondering what can happen if we're to connect it back to itself and thereby perhaps create a network of its own making. The existing condition, a sort of hallucinatory idea. What if we were to introduce mirrors at each end? And of course, that creates a known diagram, a linear extension that in an imaginary way we can think of from outside. Keith knows that as good Yale graduates, we spend a lot of time with Bramante. And in some ways, like the more fun projects of Bramante, in this case, the church San Sotiro with its illusory and perspectival arch apse. Four-letter A word architectural begins with A. And to Keith's point back in 2003, what happens if you just draw it, measure it, draw it, and then give it to Jennifer? And she introduces this figure-8 wisp of wind. What happens if you suspend a mirror and you gimbal it? What do you get? Well, you get a proof of concept GIF that Tom sends to you in the early morning, is what you get. And it was based on this that we look at some hand sketches, and we begin to get a sense of these wandering vanishing points and these perspective drawings, these different forms and characters of infinity, whether it's the toroid or the Mobius or the Klein bottle. We're not, it's no longer a static conception of space. Sorry to take that video away from you, but we really got to move on. We have also been fortunate to work with a couple of photographers and videographers. In this case, Kaylin Smith, Hackworth, and Isaac Gale. And they do an incredible job of getting inside the pieces and teasing out the inherent ambiguities that are possible. The funny thing is with this piece, it was here, word went out, but it was practically invisible until you actually got inside.
So this is a film that we made in collaboration with Isaac. So we'll just kind of let this run for a little bit. So all the sounds from that film are all like kind of distorted sounds of the actual piece itself. So it had this like very kind of like mechanical, there's screeching, like lots of springs screeching and things like that as you were actually inside of it.
And so that we did that at the same time as we were doing a couple of projects, one in Minneapolis, one in Vancouver, neither of which got billed. And we looked at that project and said, okay, how do we have to rearrange our lives so more of that gets done?
So I'm going to talk hopefully briefly about hide and seek. Films are like a kind of big part of our creative process. So I want to be able to show another couple of films that we've done, or another film that we've done with Isaac as part of this project. But this is our competition winning entry for the Young Architects program. And it happened on a really short timeline. So I think, you know, recognizing that the entire process of like designing, fabricating, installing the whole thing is less than a year. So we thought really carefully about how to present ourselves and how to work out of our own work. So some of the images that we'll show are kind of like part of our presentation that we showed to Glenn Lowry and Klaus Wiesenbach and all the people on the jury.
Marion Weiss.
And Marion Weiss, yeah, the sole architect pretty much on the jury.
The only lady.
And the only woman, which was really crazy. But anyway, we were really excited to see her because we really love her work. So we started with something we thought they would understand. So we started with art, with people, with art, and with public space. So these are images from Lorraine O'Grady's performance artwork, Art Is, that she made in response to a friend who told her that conceptual art didn't care about Black people. And so there's a kind of way in which she's, I think, working through a lot of issues about her and you know, our place in the art historical canon within this kind of, you know, canonizing gaze of the gilt frame. But there's also something very tender about kind of conserving and preserving and tending in these images. And I think that also is testament to the fact that these images weren't actually shown publicly until 2005, many years after this performance. So it kind of emphasizes that it was about this kind of presentness of that moment and the connections that were made between people then and there. So the piece consists of 15 dancers all wearing white. And they were part of this huge float that was part of the African American Day Parade in Harlem. And they were all carrying these kind of framing devices. And what really struck us about this project was the kind of persistence of this bounding edge, whether it's the kind of gilt frame as the sort of symbol of the kind of canonical, this sort of historicizing gaze, or the actual like kind of construction of the street, the buildings providing a kind of frame for the parade activities within. But then there's also this kind of, you know, temporary restraint of the police line also as another kind of demarcator in the space. And through all of that, you know, Black people find a way to signify their direct address, you know, have personal agency and cross the border, across these divisions. So this is actually the only image in this 40 image series that is in portrait orientation. And so when they're mounted, you see these like 3 rows of 13 landscape images and then this one portrait oriented image at the end. And it's, I think you can see why in terms of the kind of mixture of emotions, honestly, that are at play in the crowd. And apparently as these dancers move through the crowd, people would say, frame us, we're the art, frame us. So I think it was really also a kind of a way of claiming space. So this became a really significant quote for us. And the trick, of course, is this refusal of border under the constraint of border's constant imposition. We can't get rid of these walls. This is the reality of the site that we've been given. But how do we work to actually transgress them in some way and create a stage for belonging, setting the stage for performance? So we kind of, worked out of our own work, if this is sort of our site boundary of the kind of courtyard space preceding your entry into the museum. Instead of longing being kind of like one instance, we were interested in what happens when you take this as a kind of multiplied system, and sort of introducing this new network into the space that's kind of working counter to its sort of organizational logic, and how it was derived. So at the competition, we sort of presented, we called them these little urchin models, which were, kind of showing this sort of imaginatively like piercing the walls of the institution. So each one of these was from a kind of ray trace model that we'd kind of hit print every once in a while after people would come in and mess with the sliders and Grasshopper. Also built a kind of quarter scale model that also became kind of, somewhat didactic about some of the aims of the project. So wherever these void spaces intersected with the exterior wall, there was actually a kind of cutout peekaboo door into the model. So really, we had to ask them, I think, like 3 or 4 times, but eventually the jury actually like got up and went over and looked down and through the model.
You've got to know your audience. And in this particular case, Jennifer and I are looking at the storied space that are these 4 courtyards of PS1. And we, at an intuitive level, started to feel that there had not yet been a story just about people and challenging who gets to be welcome and in place, feel that sense of belonging in this place.
And I think we tried to use the model as a way to speak to that. Even, 3D, this woman standing to, I guess, my right in the image, our left looking at the image, Emmy Tong, she had the distinct pleasure or curse of 3D printing all of these scale figures and hand painting them, so that the model also had a kind of like life to it, and showed the sort of like diversity of skin tones, of colors, of fashion sense, and all of that, trying to bring some of that life even to the kind of representation of the model.
We had the whole jury and how they dress as scaled models.
Yeah, there's like a little Sean Anderson and a little Glenn Lowry in there somewhere. So it was like a classic Zoolander moment. They said, okay, you guys can clearly make a nice model. We'll give you the commission. Now make it at least 3 times bigger.
48 times bigger.
So then it kind of became the hard work of really figuring out how to make this thing. So we worked again with Clayton Binkley, who was at Arup at the time. And
also Kristen Strobel.
And Kristen Strobel. I was getting there. Really working through a kind of highly coordinated Rhino model, and had the benefit of doing a LiDAR scan of the courtyard. So the existing tie holes in the concrete walls became a kind of, the walls weren't really structurally sound, like you could hang anything off of them, but we were able to sort of carefully kind of calibrate and integrate this structure into.
Well, they're tippy. You can hang stuff on it, but they're not. You can't take your wind loads out.
Yeah, you can't take your lateral loads. Okay, anyway, that's true.
Sorry, that's a nerdy digression.
But things were moving kind of fast and furious, so a lot of the details are sort of hand-drawn exchanges. This is a detail drawing from Kristen, sent on a Sunday night. But then there's also the realities of making it in the place. So this video was by Justin Tan, actually, as a Cornell student, showing how this series of trusses was brought from Minneapolis to New York. These 8 pieces were welded together to make the kind of gigantic truss, and then the whole thing was sort of lifted into place. So through this sort of orchestrated dance of cranes. It was also really important to us to think about, obviously the project is recyclable, and much of it actually did get recycled at the end of it. So both the glass and the steel structure, but also thinking about who gets to build our work. So we, in some ways, kind of started a kind of intergenerational exchange of knowledge through this project. So this is Maddie, who was honestly hired straight out of trade school, But through this project, worked with really experienced millwrights and ended up getting hired by the union after working on this project. So we were really intentional about trying to hire women and people of color in the trades. And then this is kind of the, you know, the glossy image after all the like blood, sweat, and tears. The sort of program brief was to have seating, shading, and water, which we arrayed kind of sectionally across the site. So seating at the lower register, the shading, obviously the black kind of canopy fabric, which is a really beautiful kind of shade fabric from Hunter Douglas. So it really actually was a lot cooler when you were underneath that canopy. And then the water was carried by these upper trusses that had a misting system.
So you had a two-story system, if you like, an upper story and a lower story.
So along the A space is like kind of that long runway you saw in the preceding image. The D over the little triangle to the left was like the kind of technical booth or a secondary stage when they'd have performances. C was a little seat in the little baby courtyard, and then B was maybe my favorite spot in the installation, which was this big 18 by 27 foot hammock. So we were interested in how the installation could start to kind of pierce through these walls in a kind of imaginative sense. Here's a kind of closer image of the frame that took the lateral loads out of the system. Again, kind of emphasizing the sort of perspectival convergence at the center of the mirror plane image, where each of these voids hit an exterior wall. We had these, we did these graphite murals. This is Joe McGranahan, another Cornell student, who I think had graphite like ingrained in his skin and clothes for I don't know how long.
No, he was wearing the proper PPE.
Well, no, he had on a mask. It wasn't like inside his body, but on it. So, you know, these became a kind of register or a mark, a trace of where these things would hit the exterior wall. And over the course of the installation, obviously they faded with the rain and people rubbing up against them and things like that. The upper story was basically two gigantic periscopes. So from one space outside on the street, you know, outside of the paywall of the museum, you know, you could look up into these mirrors and see down into the courtyard and vice versa. So here, this is from the interior looking out to that street corner. You can see a little man walking along there. And then this is that same view of those concrete walls, now with our installation, and they're kind of reordering space, reordering the ways in which bodies move through this courtyard. You know, we were interested in a kind of analog glitchiness introduced into this environment. You know, how a solid wall might appear to peel out into a thin plane. The misting system, we kind of treated that like a reset of the scene as kind of atmospheric static. And then at night, it actually became a kind of literal watercolor, you know, carrying a kind of pre-programmed lighting system. So the installation, you know, had to kind of negotiate a couple of multiple conditions, you know, day, night, solitary museum goer, and, you know, space for 5,000 people.
Right, I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, I think what you're seeing here is where Jennifer and I were hanging the whole competition effort was really on an idea. We were introduced by, it comes out of performance, but a kind of idea of architecture as invitation that I think is really well talked about by Robin Bernstein in her article Dances with Things. And so not thinking in an objective way, but thinking perhaps instead in a non-objective way. And to that extent that Jennifer and I are able to think in terms of relationships first, as opposed to objects, we're looking to structure a series of invitations and to see that those invitations need to work for a crowd of one, but also a crowd of 5,000. And that the same element needs to work as a bench during the day, but maybe a runway at night. So that the same element performing multiple roles, really just depending upon when the sun is up in the sky.
So here's an image of, this is not at capacity, but getting there. The crowds that would be there. And obviously the title is kind of riffing off of a childhood game. Actually, I think Hazel named the piece because she was really obsessed with playing hide and seek.
Hazel's our daughter.
At the time. So firm name is from our son. This piece was named by our daughter. But there was a really pretty amazing double Dutch event that was kind of the closing party for the installation. And I'm gonna stop talking and we're gonna watch a movie briefly.
Stay with us, it's a good one.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing this. And then, sorry for technical. Where is this? Okay, hopefully this one will play louder. I feel like my volume is kind of low, but hopefully you all can hear this.
Turn it
as
up.
well. I did turn it up. It's
No,
all
I
the way
wasn't
up.
saying for you. I know ours is all the way up.
Okay, all right, here we go. All right, let me head back. Yeah. And our credits. All right, that's all we're gonna do in 5 minutes.
When I was growing up, I can remember coming downstairs in the early morning, having heard a noise. To find my mom, who in Canada, in Vancouver, she is a pediatric ophthalmologist. That is, she's looking after kids' eyes. And as I got myself some Cheerios at 5 in the morning, I come into the living room to find her editing video, and it's video of operations that she's done, reattaching retinas on kids' eyes. Early on in our practice, Jennifer and I began diagramming projects using the section of an image. This might be building on Mike Davis's article where he teases out the sectional ambiguities inherent in Velázquez Las Meninas. But it's become a very motivating way for us to spend time with work and to challenge these spaces and infrastructures that we all inherit. Challenge what kinds of loads they can bear, usually social loads. So in this case, this can be a trap. Jennifer and I come from, Jennifer mentioned earlier that we're working with difference. And I think that's true. We each come from very different backgrounds. You know, whereas I might be thinking of Tarkovsky's Stalker and the brothers Strugatsky, Jennifer, or I might be thinking of a neighbor, William Gibson. Jennifer has a whole other set of associations and motivations. And I think the key towards the working with difference, this kind of metaphoric structure, works not only conceptually for the pieces, but it also works in terms of giving a structure to the partnership where neither of us feel like we have to compromise. And yet we can each hold a pretty strong sense of intent. So for the project begin very simply. In this case, we've done a series of projects where we're flexing these illusory spaces through these masonry buildings. Here in Seattle at Mad Art, we proposed actually building one of these reflective spaces. We took this idea of working with these transparent meshes that first really came into the work, although we have been working with fabric since 2014 with Make It Rain in Vancouver. Here in Seattle, we're using blue debris netting.
Oh, we first used it in 2013 as a projection screen.
Oh, that's true for the world's rated X. Oh, that's spot on. Thank you. Debris netting is wonderful insofar as it erases a building. It creates an urban blind spot. And so we're taking a gallery that has a mission to engagement with the public and challenging them to open their reflective large pane glass doors and see if we can test out some ideas from the French surrealists about the idea of a dérive and pull people in off of their regular procedurally, like their conditioned ways of engaging with the city. So we're scribbling, but in scribbling, we're also looking to challenge ideas of the city, and in so doing, challenge the construction of the canon. You know, that we try to work really quickly and keep things discursive. We try to learn from you, Keith, in that way. But here where the city, the sort of ideal city in this case, is thought of as a kind of interior, separated and bordered away from the city. Here we're actually engaging with the public spaces of the city itself here in a kind of neighborhood for Amazon. So I'm just gonna go a little bit faster, but we're still working with ideas of infinity and occupying those spaces. But in here, we're introducing a kind of ampersand of infinity, a circulatory system of 3 overlaid figure 8s. that reach backwards from the space of the sidewalk, pulling that public space of the sidewalk deeper into the building towards these existing skylights that are at the back of the space. This is the first time we've worked with this blue debris netting, and it kind of came into being through the course of working on the project, that in fact we're dealing with a kind of chroma key compositing.
That's a kind of filmic technique, right, where you think about the blue screen or the green screen, where you can map one space onto another.
Here's our, again, close friend, engineer and artist, Clayton, with not the first nor the last cup of coffee for the day. But this in particular project, I just want to make it clear that, like, Clayton's co-author with Dream the Combine on this project. And he has a real expertise with these soft materials. And there was just something that was really wonderful about building a project together and being right up against the sidewalk and being able to talk with people as they go by. And to have someone who's walked the sidewalk 7 years in a row and never realized, first of all, that this was a gallery. And then secondly, never realized that he could actually, that it was public and open to him, and actually would be excited for him to come in. So this project had the highest, I don't know, it's not highest turnout of any of their shows that they've had.
You want to show the film?
Yes, well, no, I want to have a good discussion about the Columbus project.
Okay.
I wanted to show, I think these, what we're doing is just setting the stage for
Being able to have a conversation. But we do have another film about that one, but we're not going to show.
maybe we keep it below the fold.
Yeah. So the last project that we wanted to talk about tonight is also the most recent. Completed, gosh, like a week before or 2 weeks before we started teaching at Cornell. So it was a pretty busy summer. And I'm just going to read a few things. Obviously, we both really love language and are kind of intentional about the titles of our work and bring a lot of other kind of references into the projects. So let me tell you first of a city. It is a city built wrong by your standards. This city sprawls in a way that no modern calm would be permitted to do, since that would require too many miles of walls. And this city's outermost sprawls have branched off along rivers and other lifelines to spawn additional cities, much in the manner of mold forking and stretching along the rich veins of a growth medium. Too close together, you would think. Too much overlap of territory. They are too connected. Sometimes they have distinct local nicknames, these child cities, especially where they are large or old enough to have spawned child cities of their own. But this is superficial. Your perception of their connectedness is correct. They have the same infrastructure, the same culture, the same hungers and fears. Each city is like the other cities. All of the cities are effectively one city. This world in this now is the city's name. And so this is a project called Columbia Colombo Colón. And this was a project that we did as part of the Miller Prize in Columbus, Indiana. And at the intersection of I-65 and State Road 46, as you're entering Columbus, Indiana, there's a landscape sign encouraging you to discover Columbus. And we encountered this sign on our first site visit to Indiana. And just kind of going, and we'd never been there before, going to just kind of do a site visit for this biennial that's hosted there. And the sign's message links Christopher Columbus's efforts, quote unquote, discovering the new world, to the world discovering Columbus, Indiana. This play on words lightly references a very serious set of papal decrees executed from 1452 to 1493 that established the doctrine of discovery, the Dum Diversas, the Romanus Pontifex, and the Intercaetera. These documents enabled the slavery of non-Christians and gave exclusive and total right to the lands encountered through exploration to the empires who found them. in disregard of the long histories of habitation by indigenous peoples. They opened the door for the land theft, resource extraction, slavery, and genocide that are part of our collective past, as well as the ongoing acts of resistance to these trajectories. Our ability to persevere through the everyday reach of this violence is a hopeful counter-narrative to our involute history. So through this kind of continual overwriting, Columbus and its derivations have mutated with the interests of identity, property, and power. I think it was, we came pretty guns blazing talking about like how this sign was, actually quite shocking and maybe not the first thing that you want to say about your fair city. But there's also a way in which, the name Columbus is so prevalent, it's everywhere. It almost renders the name somewhat meaningless or fades into the background of normalcy. He's sort of everywhere all at the same time. So Columbus and the kind of female derivation Columbia, and then moving into two other languages of Colombo and Colón, they're a movie company.
And
They're a school.
I would just like to acknowledge that we have a close friend and often heartwarming critic, Ozair Saluji, who's in the audience this evening, who weighed in at a very crucial time, a pivotal time in the life of this project. And just want to recognize and say thank you.
Thanks, Ozair. So Columbia is a school, it's a movie company. Columbus is a movie, a shopping mall, a soccer team, a country in South America, a steamy looking novel, a fraternal Catholic order, a district in Panama, a bus, a communications company in Barbados, a neighbor to the east of Columbus, Indiana. Don't get them confused because they don't like that. It's a Nazi era opera written by this guy. It's a tubing company, an excursion liner, and a sausage company, and some really great branding. These names have been proxies for liberty and virtue, such as Columbia, the female personification of the US, as well as euphemisms for newness, risk-taking, and curiosity. The juxtaposition of Columbus onto the territory his actions helped expropriate from our first communities is an expression of a series of devastating actions, the genocidal taking and parceling of land into property. So the names Columbus, Columbia, Colombo, and Colón remind us that through throughout the frayed reality of our body politic, the past is always present and histories are braided. These are symbols extending globally in every direction. In this rhizomatic network, one thing is connected to all the others. So we started with this project, thinking about the specific place of Columbus, Indiana, but also that it's part of this kind of larger system of signification and meaning, and this like kind of broadly distributed global system. So where each Columbus is connected to every other on the globe. So we did these kind of initial mappings looking at Columbus's, Columbia, Colombo, and Colón. And just kind of the sheer density of these marks, and that they sort of, indicate this kind of global network of influence. BO4, Colombia, Las Tunas, Cuba, circa 1909. The people we now call Taíno discovered Christopher Columbus and the Spaniards. He did not discover us, as we were home and they were lost at sea when they landed on our shores. We survived because many of our ancestors ran off into the mountains after 1533, when Indian slaves were granted their freedom by the Spanish monarchy. Any Spaniard who was reluctant to let their Taíno slaves go would simply reclassify them as African. Paper genocide means that a people can be made to disappear on paper. No matter how you may look physically or assert your identity, you are extinct. This is paper genocide, a narrative created by the conquerors and perpetrated by every subsequent researcher. Our identities have always been hidden in plain sight. Jorge Estevez is part of this article that we cited as part of this project. So our project site was Millrace Park, which itself is a site of a kind of erasure in service of city beautification. This place was formerly called Death Valley. And while the city of Columbus and its patrons were building these kind of incredible works of architecture by Saarinen and others, people were living at the other end of this street in this park, or in what was later turned into this park, in these shacks. So there's this kind of simultaneous narratives happening that are still persisting today. And so kind of what are the stories that Columbus tells about itself in terms of its own origins and own myths that it perpetuates. So we were really interested in this kind of deeper section, right? How the hill that our project is actually sited on is the fill that was cut to form the lake that was part of the park. So these things are kind of embedded in the landscape and hidden in plain sight. DO2, Colón, Merida, Venezuela, 1550, founded or named in 1558. Translation from Spanish to English. Analyzing the statues of a city, their location in particular places, how many are of men and how many of women, how many are rich and how many are poor, and how many are heroes and how many are martyrs. A mapping of aspirations can be made of a society, or at least of what they have wanted to do with it from the strategic reconstruction of their past. And when that society by its own hands takes on the task of revisiting those stories and breaking those idols, it is because it is undoubtedly heading to write a new story, pondering and enlarging its characters from another perspective. So Dream the Combine exists to question the construction of images as a means to opening up who architecture is for. In this project, our response considered how the site upholds certain images, symbols, certain narratives over others. The installation then became a series of props without their images, vertical markers that held counter stories.
Poles without their flags.
So on each of these kind of vertical elements, there was spiraling text, and these are the quotations that I've been reading, our kind of selection of these texts. This one I loved. B70, Columbia, California, USA, 1850. Columbia, glorious 4th of July, 2021 celebration. Flag raising and black musket salute, band concert, needle in the haystack, parade at noon, watermelon eating contest, bucket brigade, papete demonstration, nail pounding contest, grease pole contest, egg relay race, egg talks, cakewalk, 5-way tug of war, pulled pork barbecue. Columbia Chamber of Commerce. So this is our studio. Half of the building is a place where a guy stores cans, and the other half was where we made this project. We sort of made this long lathe where we could turn each of the poles, polishing them. Backing them. They got polished so that they would kind of glimmer and gleam. This is in their rough state before they got shiny again. Cutting out these texts out of this silvery adhesive mylar material. And actually, it became kind of like editing a series of film strips. So we started to make these long narrative strips that then would get wound onto the pole in this spiraling motion.
I think we've texted some of these images with those there as they were happening.
So these are kind of shop drawings, and then these sort of piles of text, which became kind of artifacts in their own right.
Mm-hmm.
These looping narratives. And these poles were actually arranged as a kind of scaled mapping of the world, of these kind of 58 points that we selected, a kind of a selection of Columbus, Columbia, Colombo, Colón cities across the world. And we actually used the Mercator projection as a way of mapping these onto a kind of two-dimensional surface, because it was similar to the mapping that was used at the time of exploration. And so what it means is when you're standing at any one pole, you're on a kind of correct compass heading relative to the other poles. So it's sort of a scaled down navigational system. And actually reading the text sort of induces this kind of spiraling movement around each of the poles. And of course that has to do with Columbus too, because the module on the Apollo 11 trajectory was actually named Columbia. So A05, Columbus, Mississippi, USA, 1819. I didn't go to the moon. I went much further, for time is the longest distance between two places. So here are just views of the installation. Deep down, we would like to see our problems resolved by decree. This is CO4 Colombo Parana, Brazil, named 1890. Deep down, we would like to see our problems resolved by decree. From this date onwards, that unresolved grief is considered null, and over it, perpetual silence. Extinguished by law all remorse, damn anyone who looks back. Back there is nothing and nothing more. But problems are not resolved. Problems have a large family. And on Sundays, everyone goes out for a walk about the problem, your lady, and other little problems. So I think we're, in some ways participating in the site itself. The siting of the project, evokes the kind of city on a hill in a lot of different ways, but that you're walking through this sort of landscape of kind of contentious or challenging narratives, and through the kind of fragmented piecing together of this story, you start to construct your own narrative as you move through the installation.
You can see on the hill, and here there's this pavilion by Stanley Sadowitz behind, who has a kind of series of wonderful little pavilions in this park. This, you can see at the upper register of this hill, this is North America. And so when you say that America is a city on the hill, is this the shining light that you're talking about? The far edge of the hill is British Columbia, which is where I grew up. And I remember as a kid wondering, what is a Columbia and what makes it British? So we had a number of discussions about, is this reenactment? If we're setting out Columbus, Sri Lanka, which is to the my point is just that you could stand at Columbus, Indiana, the pole, and you could stare at Vancouver or Victoria, British Columbia, that pole. And because of the nature of the projection, you would be able to, you would be on a straight line connecting to that actual point.
I think doing the research for this project was, there were some times when we would just pause and need to kind of like take in what we had just read. I'm in kind of thinking about the research for this project and looking at this image, I'm sort of reminded of my mother talking and reminiscing and talking about the land in which she grew up. She grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. And I think she really misses the kind of red earth of the clay soil of that place. And so there's a kind of way in which, at the same time, it was a place of kind of extreme segregation, and, her windows got blown out when she was a little kid. My grandmother got escorted home by the National Guard. So these are histories that are personal, that are persistent, and they are kind of, shrouded in normalcy. The plantation was beautiful, right? This land is very beautiful, but it holds a lot of tortured histories. So this is one of the narratives that I always like to call attention to, because I think it's important that these young men are named. A10, Columbus, Texas, USA, 1837. Ernest Collins, age 15, and Benny Mitchell, 16, were lynched at the Hanging Tree on November 12, 1935. While in custody and chained neck to neck, they were dragged from a sheriff's car by masked white men that grew to a 700-person mob. The county attorney condoned the actions as the, quote, will of the people. The motto of the city remains live oaks for live folks due to the many oak trees in the city. Not read that one. So I think we can kind of stop here. This is our latest project. We're still kind of in the process of working with Isaac to develop another film for this project. But yeah, so to be continued. We're still kind of working through all the layers of this one. Yeah.
He was there on Indigenous Peoples Day,
Yeah.
October 11th.
He was just there on October 11th. So to be continued regarding this one. But thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Tom. We have some time for questions, a little bit. So if anyone has a question or a comment for Tom and Jennifer. Thank you so much for the work. It's really beautiful and thoughtful. And I appreciate the connection to making and grounding in the places where you're fabricating these installations, or where you're installing the installations that you fabricate. And so maybe I'll just, we were talking before the lectures, we were making sure that all the media worked correctly. About what I think is a good fit between your work and the culture at CCA, which is very much a culture of making and testing things at full scale. We've had a lot of installations in the back lot. It's just like, it's part of the ethos of the college, and always has been. You know, it began as California College of Arts and Crafts, so there's always been that put stuff together, get your hands dirty. And I don't necessarily have a question with this, but I'm excited to sort of see you present your practice and how you connect that commitment to fabrication, commitment to installation, putting things out there in the world, to the kind of philosophy that you carry as citizens of the world, right? Of the places where you live and work. And to your desire, clearly, I think is demonstrated in the last project, to sort of, interrogate the state of the world through the things you make. So maybe there is a sort of a question nested in there, like speaking to that kind of framework that guides your activities, when you're in the shop. And maybe where those things connect, like clearly it's happening in your research, but then like we know, and I appreciate your remembering something I said to you a long time ago, Jennifer, which was probably said like totally, off the cuff, like in a moment of like frustration and a desperate, I'm sure, right? Your frustration, or perhaps mine.
No, maybe it was your.
Yeah,
You're like,
might have been
stop
mine.
making these models that are too like, just
Precious.
stop. You were like hot glue gun, cardboard, Jennifer. Like they don't need to be so precise and beautiful. What's your advice?
Well, I'm glad that you retained the capacity to make precise and beautiful things in the face of that reckless criticism that you got. But maybe that the question is right there, like, in that moment of making, how are you actually thinking about the ideas manifesting themselves in the work? You're like,
yeah, I mean, I think
grinding
like
a well. Go ahead.
For the last project, I think there was like, we wanted those things to seem like they just went into the earth forever, right? So there was a way of like how do we detail it so it looks like these things are just like, you can also imagine the kind of like that they had this sort of projective capacity to have a kind of deep section in the site. So So, you know, if you look at it, it's like they just look like they're just sort of suspended there or coming out of the earth. Also, the level of polish, like I feel like that was like kind of a process trying to figure out how we wanted to sand them. You know, do we want to sand them like linearly? Do we want to sand them like with rotation? Like what grit sandpaper? Like, okay, we've tried a few, let's bring it out into the sunlight and see how it looks against the sky. Like, where does it start to sort of disappear and get this kind of like gossamer way in which it carries the light? So I think all of those things we're trying to be really intentional about, because we wanted it to almost look like a rendering, like these like white lines just sort of dividing the space like a kind of frame rate. But anyway, that's my geeking out about like the finish of the poles. But
it's funny, like just hearing you talk, Keith, I just realized that Jennifer runs intuitively more long form, whereas I work really well with aphorism. And hopefully neither of those are basic. But I asked this sculptor mentor, Ursula, she was driving me across the Williamsburg Bridge after work one day, and I think I've left undergrad before finishing. And I just asked her like a really dumb question. How do you know when a sculpture's finished? And she just says, oh, you feel it. And so I think to your point about fabrication and how does that feed in, we haven't let a single project out of the studio until it gets to this really visceral spot. And it gets to like, you know, when you see, I don't know, like Gaudi's Chapel Guel, I think it is, and you just see like stone on top of stone on top of stone, and you can feel that compression in your teeth, like if you just clench and drive your teeth up into your gums, like you just feel that thing. You know, when you're reading the Brother Strugatsky book, Roadside Picnic, like you feel the squeeze of that, the climax in that narrative. So I think there's something about a sort of way that architecture and its relationship to the body, that it can unlock a number of different epistemologies, like ways of knowing that are not always recognized in other arenas of learning.
yeah, like you can't really talk about it, but you can like maybe try and approach it because you sort of know it when you see it. Is that what you're getting at?
And more importantly,
you know when you feel it.
and more importantly, I think it opens you up to being able to have perhaps unsaid dialogues with like the people in Publix that go into this place or any place, you know, that people feel it. And you don't, you know, sometimes it might just be a glance is what they say to you as they're leaving. Even if they know that you're
Mitch McEwen and Jerome Hayford, they were like, when they went to hide and seek, they're like, something else is going on here. Like they couldn't really like say what it was, but they're just like, huh, like I'm in like some other kind of weird space now. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer. We should like
yeah, I said it was supposed to be all aphorism and that was going on forever.
Well, in fact, you answered a question that came in after you started answering my semi-question. But we have two more questions. So Bennett, I think that they kind of answered your question about when do you know you're done. But Jason Kelly Johnston first has a comment, stunning and thoughtful work for the two of you, but asks, can you talk a little about the challenges of collaboration with each other and with your team and others? And then we have a question from Nora following that.
Well, I think Tom said earlier that we don't compromise, and that is true. Like we each have our own motivations that we kind of bring to the project. And sometimes it's like they get, I mean, the thing I think is really fascinating is that like the work can hold the multiplicity of our like kind of interpretations of what we're doing. Like, and then we kind of feed each other in that way. I mean, I think that we definitely don't always agree, but I think the reason why I think the firm is called the firm, it's not a firm. It's not a firm. It's a studio. It's like, there's nothing like firm about what we're doing.
Yeah, you might as well call it the risk.
Yeah, the risk is what it is. But it becomes kind of this third thing that we're sort of working in service of. So it's like a way to like like displace the ego and say, well, okay, now we're working in service of this idea, this thing that we want to make in the world. So if it's a good idea that comes from you, great. If it's a good idea that comes from me, great. If it's a good idea that comes from someone we're collaborating with, it makes it into the project. I think we're really kind of open in that way. You know, I don't know if, do we have like vicious disagreements about what we're doing? Maybe not. At the end of the day, we're married. So it's like we want to stay married. So
Can't go home and complain about your coworkers.
Yeah.
But I don't mean to be glib about it, right? Like there's things move working with Jennifer. You know, I could be very happy
in a studio by yourself, not having to collaborate with me. You can say it. It's okay.
You know, this is like collaboration is terrifying, right? Because there's you like pushing the ego away is terrifying. Because then you actually have to be present and live with these decisions. And you actually have to engage in these feedback loops and, like, dare I say, like actually be an authentic like version of yourself, because there's nowhere to hide. You know, I think it's important to say there's no compromises, because for both of us, I think there's ways that Dream the Combine as a project is a way to reach back to deeper moments of time. Like there is something to a degree, and forgive me, Keith, but there's some aspect of my experience in graduate school that had a kind of quality of erasure to it. And Dream the
Quite
Combine,
literally, I was told there's no such thing as a Black architect, and or Black architecture, and I was like, I'm here. What does that mean?
So to a degree, you're seeing a dance with Dream the Combine as a kind of vehicle that allows us to get back to like deeper and more persistent waters and motivations.
Yeah, we like, I don't know. I think we both want that for each other.
It's interesting.
I'm perfectly happy to negotiate, but not compromise.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, I'm balancing a million things, so I typed my question, my really quick lowball question, but simple question. I guess what I was hoping to refer to was so many of the projects that I've, you know, so much of your work, like it takes it really far, but then there's like another layer to it, and you are having to go further and go in, and then it seems like kind of compulsive, and I love that. I mean, it seems like you're tracking into something that just has another layer, and then you get there and you think, oh, it's complete, and then you see in the distance this other kind of weird thing, and so it's really exciting to see that. I mean, you're not kind of reducing the ideas. It seems like everything has one other thing, like you're talking about, you know, which way you want to sand the pipe, and just all of those layers, I think are fascinating. So you know, and it's I was excited. I didn't realize I didn't know I wasn't sure of what the collaboration was, what the setup was, but now that I have seen you guys talk and articulate your work, it just, you know, totally kind of makes sense now, because it's clear that it's not like a single author situation. There's like so many levels to it, and it's just, you know, super fascinating. So I just, you know, thank you so much for sharing the work, and I'm super excited that you guys are in the world and seem like really great people, and you're awesome designers. So it's inspiring. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Jason.
And I should also say, with the Columbus project, that project would not have happened without Kathy Cow and Arseny Pekirovsky, who are two amazing former students of mine. That you know, Arseny, we called him the watchmaker, because he was like, you know, with the tweezers, like putting those little letters on all those poles. It was kind of intense.
Also, like to your point about layers, Jason, we got to work with Columbus Public Works.
Yeah, that was awesome.
So like they're the ones driving these things.
It was like a kind of autocritical moment of like, okay, yeah, you're like coming in hard hitting about Columbus. but we're gonna like help you put these polls in the
And,
ground.
and ultimately, like this is this incongruous thing where you have this really generous town and it has a kind of generous culture that actually cares about like cultivating public and publics and these people are just like, they don't like taking no for an answer. You know, when we had troubles like getting these things into that slope, they go back to the shop and weld up a thing, and next day we go out and drive these poles 8 feet into the ground to keep the engineer happy. And you know, there's a little bit of just like banging the rocks together, but there's also
There's a spirit of generosity there.
yeah, and I think there was a Anjali, I forgot her last name.
Anjali Rao.
Anjali Rao wrote a really interesting article about the kind of larger exhibition this year as being a kind of testing of public space, challenging assumptions around public space and belonging. And I thought that there's something about that particular city that is actually really fascinating. You know, that they're actually open to being autocritical at the scale of a city is something that they're actually willing to engage and genuinely follow through with a kind of project that is about institutional critique. It is fascinating to me still. Don't understand it.
Great question, Jason. And then Nora has a question too, but Nora, I'll let you ask your question. But before you do, I regretfully now have to like slip away quietly into the Zoom night to parent. So
We talked for too long, so. it's
oh, no,
okay.
you didn't. It was fantastic. And Nora, I wish I could stay for the answer to your question because I think it's such a good one. But Tom and Jennifer, I'll thank you before I depart. It's been fantastic seeing you. I want to see you like full size and real with food and drink in front of us. So we'll make that happen sometime in the hopefully near future. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Nora.
Who's in charge now?
Well, I can read your question.
Oh yeah, you can read it. I mean, and I could also just like ad lib real fast, but I love the film, and I was thinking, you know, watching the film that Isaac did for PS1 and having seen previous films of your work, you know, with I think it was the train, I don't remember the name of the project that takes place on the train tracks. Yeah. So I was thinking, this has the Columbus project has this whole new dimension, which is the text. And there was this aspect to you reading it that was so powerful, like to both see the text on the screen, but also to hear somebody speaking at the same time. And it just got me thinking about the way that you produced the film for that project. And if you're already having ideas about how the film itself has the capacity to absorb some of that.
Yeah, I mean, even just how I think you land on something really important, that like there's something really different happening when you hear it spoken versus just reading it on a screen or reading it on the pole even. I mean, we were like, okay, people are gonna spiral, but you get dizzy. Like that's the whole point, is to make you kind of like dizzy and sort of, you know, contending with what you're reading, but that you feel that viscerally, physically in the body, right? And then you sort of stumble off to the next one and you use the pole to steady yourself, and then you read another one. But so people did engage with the work in that way and read it in that way. But another thing that I didn't anticipate is people would they would find a partner and they would stand on opposite sides of the pole and read their half of the pole, and the other person would complete the sentence and read their half. So instead of spiraling, it became a kind of like participatory thing between two people to speak it back and forth to each other. So I don't know. I mean, in our work with Isaac, it's like we kind of like tell him some things we want him to shoot, but then he goes out, and it's a way for us also to like learn about the work and see it through someone else's eyes. And so I think that's a future conversation about how do we bring the sort of spoken word aspect of the text into the film? Is it a kind of 2-channel thing where it's like moving between two speakers, and like maybe you hear a fragment of the text on one side and another fragment on the other side. And so there's a kind of spatial aspect to the sound of the film. We did a piece that we didn't talk about today called Tracking earlier this year with Isaac. That was a kind of distributed, we're really into these distributed systems, but I think it's just like we don't want to make objects. But it was a piece that happened entirely over text message. So it was a like kind of, it was a piece about winter really, and about the winter season. And so we sent out these sort of text message prompts to people who had registered through, I don't know what the name of that place was, pro-texting. Like it was this really cool online interface. But anyway, and so we sent these text prompts and then they would send us back audio recordings and videos and photos and things like that. And so we made an audio piece with Isaac using these like fragments from, you know, I don't know, 130 different people. So we are already kind of like, you know, making these sound pieces with him. So I think it is a really good question of like, how does the text come into the film? You know, even like the kind of editing of the text to like get it onto the pole was sort of like a, you know, cutting room floor kind of process. So I think there's lots of ways in which it's looping through, and I'm not quite sure yet how they're going to become manifest. And sometimes Tom is hearing all of this for the first time. I thought about the Live 2 channel.
Isaac's got a couch in his editing room. And so working with Isaac can be a lot like couples therapy. Like it's just, you know, we're just sitting on the couch and we're listening and
watching and having scotch maybe.
Oh, there has been. It's been known to happen. And so there is a sort of exercise of just tabling a lot of, I call them hallucinations, primarily just to be able, sometimes you got to work through things and just get them out of your system. So for instance, on this project, I was like, Isaac, come on, we've always wanted to have a chyron. The text just like flow across the bottom of the screen. What do you think? You know, like you just got to get these really terrible ideas out of the way. You know, with the hide and seek video, which we showed today, we talked about Columbus the sausage. Like he had like the footage for the hide and seek piece was like kind of a lot of sausage. Like there was just, it was really cut up.
There wasn't like a ton of great footage because the PS1 decided to have this event on the same day that Isaac came to shoot.
The director of communications at PS1 went absolutely, like there was sort of internal things so it's good to know that it doesn't always, no, it's not just me, for example, that things are uncoordinated. But where I was going is that the kind of Isaac's genius, if I can call it that, on the hide and seek video, was that time, like you have still images and you have moving images. And so in the film, he's manipulating time, and sometimes time stops in terms of a still image, even though the sort of, obviously the frame rate continues. And then sometimes the frame rate continues again. And so there is a sort of expansion and compression of time in that little video that might be an opportunity, a way to bring in the voice of reading some of these polls.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we work pretty hard to get project permissions, and sort of like the research was one thing, and we were researching right up to the last minute because things were happening. It wasn't just the Chamber of Commerce in
California.
In
oh
California.
Yeah, a week
Penobscot, Maine.
A week before we printed the polls, Penobscot, Maine. I guess Maine was having like its, I don't know, some city or maybe it was the whole state was having like their bicentennial or something. And they had replica ships, like replica Columbus.
Santa Rosa sailed into
Santa Maria.
Like Santa Maria, into like the Penobscot. Sorry, I was saying.
I love it when you're like just being really Canadian in the moment. You're like, I don't know, Nina Pinto, Santa Maria, whatever. But they had these replica like Columbus ships that went into Penobscot Bay.
Like, can you imagine?
And so
He never actually just
even
landed on the
landed.
mainland.
I know, it's just like ridiculous. But anyway, so they issued this statement that we just printed in its entirety, verbatim on the main
but with their,
Columbiaville or whatever main pole.
but with consent, right? With their permission and
Yeah.
knowledge.
But we contacted certainly all of the like, you know, indigenous. We're really frozen. I don't know how long we were talking, but we're supposed to wrap it up now anyway.
Wait,
So
what was the statement? Was it like, oh, what was their statement?
Oh, it was just a statement, and we printed the whole thing in its entirety. I mean, the poles are 20 feet tall, and the statement went, you know, like 18 feet up into the air, so it sort of disappeared against the sky. But it was basically this incredible condemnation, and just, I mean, I think what was, I mean, to be expected, but it also was like kind of intense when you're doing this research, is how much the narratives are all the same. The things that were on the Penobscot, the main poll said by the Penobscot Nation are the same things that Arthur Manuel is saying in British Columbia. You know, this persistent need to proclaim your right to exist. It was just really stunning. And those two polls are at opposite ends of the installation, but they say the same, they have this sort of same sentiment. But anyway, thank you so much for having us here. This was really fantastic. Great question.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Tom. This was really, really great. Thank you so much for sharing your work, inspiring all of us.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Really,
you
I really
so much.
appreciate it.
I mean, we don't mean to foreclose further questions. We love questions. It's Jennifer at Dream the Combine and Tom at Dream the Combine. We really appreciate everybody making time to be with us tonight. And thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you